Hey everyone, this is our Sunday Bible study for March 21st, 2021. Continuing our study in the Foundations material from the Gospel Advocate. And this quarter we are looking at the letters of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. We're in Lesson 3. This lesson is entitled The Knowledge of Paul. And it's taken from 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. I want to remind you that we only got a few more lessons that I'm going to be doing in this format because on April 11th, we're going to start having Sunday Bible classes on Sunday night at 5 o'clock. And so the material that I've been teaching through video format like this, that's going to be the material that they're going to be using in the auditorium. Several of our elders are going to take turns in teaching that material. And so that will be live streamed from our Facebook page. And so you'll have access to that through our Facebook page. And so I won't be teaching the material through this format. It'll be done from our auditorium during our normal Bible study time, which is going to be Sunday nights at 5 o'clock. We're slowly trying to phase things back in, trying to regain some normalcy. And that's going to be done in stages. I'm excited about that and excited to have more opportunities to be together and studying from God's Word and worshiping Him. And so that's coming up April 11th. And so I'll still teach from this material. I'll teach a lesson a week from now on the 28th, March 28th. And then again on Easter Sunday, which is April 4th, there'll be a video uploaded. But then after that, it will transition to the live stream from our auditorium for Sunday Bible study on Sunday nights at 5 o'clock. If you live in the area, hope that you'll come and join us for that. We would love to have you. Back to our lesson. We're here looking at the knowledge of Paul. We're in 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, as I said, verses 1 through 12. Last week, we noticed chapter 1. We noticed the fact that the congregation here in Thessalonica is a great congregation. And in chapter 2, Paul's going to deal with some issues that he wants to kind of try to head off at the pass. Anywhere Paul went, he faced opposition from different places, and many times they would do their best to smear the character of Paul in order to try to pull those who had obeyed the gospel away from Christianity. The author of the book begins in the introduction by saying the Apostle Paul faced opposition throughout his ministry. Some opposition came from false teachers. For example, Elymas openly challenged Paul and Barnabas during the first missionary journey. And that's recorded in Acts chapter 13, verses 8 through 12. Other opposition came from religious leaders. The Jews in Antioch of Pisidia opposed the things spoken by Paul. Acts chapter 13, verse 45. And this also occurred in Thessalonica, which we noticed that at length in the very first lesson for this quarter in Acts chapter 17, the opposition that they faced. For some of the evil men, it says, from the marketplace, or excuse me, I skipped a line. For the Jews who were not persuaded, becoming envious, took some of the evil men from the marketplace and gathered a mob and set all the city in an uproar. Acts 17, verse 5. And of course, you remember that mob came to the house of Jason. They dragged him and some other Christians out. Of course, Paul was sent away by night to protect him, but this was a common occurrence for the Apostle Paul to face this opposition. If Paul and his companions escaped physical abuse, they were belittled. In Thessalonica, it was said, "These who have turned the world upside down have come here too." After Paul left the location, his enemies would begin their negative attacks. Whether they questioned his authority, mocked his speaking ability, or challenged the message he proclaimed, they sought to undermine his influence. You see, they can't really undermine Christianity, and so they seek to undermine the people's confidence in the one who presented that message to them. Defending himself against such attacks, Paul told the Corinthians, "For I consider that I am not at all inferior to the most eminent apostles. Even though I am untrained in speech, yet I am not in knowledge. But we have been thoroughly manifested among you in all things." Corinth was one of those areas where his apostleship had been challenged, and Paul set out to answer that challenge. His greatest defense was his conduct. This is why he resolved to guard his behavior carefully. Explaining, he wrote, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." In our lesson text, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 1 through 12, Paul defends his conduct to the Thessalonians. They knew his time with them had been fruitful, verse 1. They also knew both his motives and methods. Paul was not selfish. He did not use flattering words to gain an advantage. He did not seek glory from men. Instead, he worked with the Thessalonians in a gentle yet concerned manner. If anyone spoke evil of Paul or attempted to discredit his ministry in Thessalonica, the brethren could declare otherwise. Making this point, Paul declared, "You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe." Paul's ministry spoke for itself. And so in these 12 verses, Paul sets out to answer these attacks, to reassure the brethren of their reason for coming, of their motives, of their methods, to let them know that they had nothing to question, that everything was above board. Paul had done all these things because of his love for the gospel and his love for God. Beginning in verse 1, although Paul's time in Thessalonica was brief, it was productive. Luke reported that Paul spent 3 Sabbaths reasoning with the Jews in the synagogue, Acts chapter 17 and verse 2. This did not necessarily mean that he spent only 3 weeks total in the city. He later reminded the brethren at Thessalonica how he and his companions labored night and day, that they might not be a burden to any of them. And so Paul and Silas and Timothy, they had spent a lot of time in Thessalonica, more than likely. Obviously not as long as they had wanted. Paul had to be rushed out because of the severe persecution that occurred. But we see that Paul had spent some time there, and so these brethren knew him. Verse 1, "For you yourselves know, brethren, that our coming to you was not in vain." Paul begins here by saying, look, what I'm about to talk to you about, you know. This isn't something that you're unaware of, because you saw it with your own eyes, you heard it with your own ears. And he says, our coming to you was not in vain. We didn't come to you and nothing happened. We came to you and you responded. You were obedient. And as a result, the church began there in Thessalonica. If Paul's enemies, the author says, were arguing his efforts in Thessalonica were wasted, the brethren knew otherwise. As Bruce noted, the Thessalonians' positive response to the gospel and subsequent energy in spreading it abroad bore sufficient testimony both to the quality of the preaching and to the power that accompanied it. You know, as we noticed last week, the brethren there, this is the word of the Lord, it sounded forth from Thessalonica. Even to the point Paul said we don't even have to say anything because everything that needs to be said is being said. And so we have a very good example here of the brethren and what was taking place, and the fact that the brethren could trust in Paul because he was spreading the gospel, and that they knew the type of person that he was. The author writes, in addition to their attempt to discredit Paul's work in Thessalonica because of its brevity, his detractors evidently sought to besmirch his reputation by referencing his imprisonment in Philippi. This attack also proved unsuccessful, for Paul had not hidden his past from the brethren. Rather than viewing his imprisonment in Philippi with shame, Paul emphasized how that event proved his sincerity. Verse 2 says, "But even after we had suffered before and were spitefully treated at Philippi," you recall that they were beaten as Romans and they had not been condemned. And so that was a big deal. That was something that should not have happened. And you remember Paul made a point to have the magistrates apologize to them for what had taken place. Why did Paul do that? Because he knew that could affect his ministry. He knew that could have a negative effect on the cause of Christ. And so he references here the fact that they were spitefully treated at Philippi. He says, "As you know, we were bold in our God to speak to you the gospel of God in much conflict." Edwards explained, Paul reasoned as follows. If he and his companions had been insincere, they would have ceased in the face of this opposition. Since they did not cease their preaching, the logical conclusion is that they were sincerely motivated. If someone doesn't have sincere motives, once things start getting tough, once Satan really starts hurling difficulties their way, most of the time that insincere person, that's it, they're out. And Paul says, we've gone through this, we were beaten, and yet we're still here. We're still teaching and preaching, and that showed that they had sincere motives, that their motives were above board. In verse 3, the book says, "For our exhortation did not come from error or uncleanness, nor was it in deceit." The term exhortation in the New King James Version is also translated appeal in the ESV. According to Jeffrey A.D. Wema, this preaching was no neutral presentation of the facts about Jesus, but an urgent appeal to turn from idols to the living God and accept His Son as deliverer from the coming wrath. And Paul says, we didn't come to you and appeal to you the way we did. It wasn't out of error. The things that we taught you were the truth. It wasn't out of uncleanness. There wasn't some impure motive going on here. And it wasn't in deceit. We didn't seek to deceive you in order to get something from you. And so this appeal that Paul made, he wants them to know that it wasn't out of any of those things. And more than likely, with him addressing those areas, those were areas that probably his critics were attacking him on. And he says that's not the reason that we appealed to you. None of those things were the case. Verse 4, "But as we have been approved by God to be entrusted with the gospel, even so we speak, not as pleasing men, but God who tests our hearts." The author says Paul counted it a privilege and a responsibility to be entrusted with the gospel. Consequently, he preached with the intention of pleasing God, not man. Friends, as we go through this life, that always needs to be our attitude. The things that we do, the things that we say, we need to have our primary focus as pleasing God, not men. If we're going to please God, there are going to be times that we're not going to please man. If we're going to please God, there are going to be times that there will be people who are angry with us, who say unkind things to us, who maybe even make up falsehoods about us. But our focus must be on God. That's who we're seeking to please. And that's who Paul was seeking to please. And Paul says, when we presented the message to you, it wasn't in order to please men, but to please God. And he says, the God who tests our hearts. He said, if there's any doubt, remember God's the one that tests our hearts. You recall that he talks about in other places about how they presented the word not just in delivering it and preaching it, but in power. In other words, they were able to perform miracles. Well, they wouldn't have been able to do that if God was not with them. And so God tested their hearts, and obviously God said that what they were saying was true because they were able to work these miracles. And so Paul felt a great responsibility being entrusted with the gospel. And so as a result of that, he reminds them, we didn't preach it to please men, but in order to please God. That brings us to a second section in this chapter as Paul begins to relate their care for them as the gentleness of a mother. Beginning in verse 5, he says, "For neither at any time did we use flattering words, as you know, nor a cloak for covetousness, God is witness." Paul says we didn't say a bunch of things to tickle your ears. You turn on the TV, you go to the stations where the televangelists are. Many times, very few of those actually say anything that could be considered controversial. Everything's always, I'm thinking mainly the one that comes to my mind is Joel Osteen. You can listen to an entire, quote, sermon, I hate to even call it that, and never hear a single scripture quoted. Many times it's just a motivational speech to tickle the ears of people. Paul says we didn't use flattering words. And he says we didn't use it as a cloak for covetousness. In other words, there wasn't anything about greed going on here. We weren't using the gospel as a way to get something from you, to take from you. And he says, once again, God's witness to this. Back to He's made kind of mention of this a few times now. They couldn't have done what they did if God was not with them. And so he says, this isn't just me telling you this. God is the one who's a witness to this as well. Verse 6, nor did we seek glory from men, either from you or from others, when we might have made demands as apostles of Christ. The author of the book says that three important claims are found in these verses 5 and 6. First, unlike false teachers who mouth great swelling words, flattering the people to gain advantage, Jude 16, Paul spoke in a straightforward manner. And so Paul says, hey, here it is. I just laid it out for you. Second, he did not use preaching as a pretext for greed. This point was so important that Paul stressed it not only here, but also he'll stress it again in verse 9. In fact, David J. Williams wrote, he calls God to witness that greed plays no part in their missionary service. Third, he did not seek glory, personal recognition, or fame. His focus was on Christ's identity and the message of the gospel, not on himself. Summarizing Paul's defense in this section, Michael Holmes observed, besides this concern over means and motives is Paul's obvious concern for the integrity of the message. He deliberately avoided behavior or actions that might lead people to doubt or suspect the integrity of the message or the sincerity of his preaching. And so Paul here is trying to make sure that they understand that the message was true. He doesn't want anything to distract from that. You look at these three things, and you think about those who preach in order to get something out of it. He didn't use flattering words in order to smooze the people. Secondly, he didn't use preaching as a pretext for greed. You look at some of these televangelists, and I mean, they're just multi-millionaires. And you have to wonder, is some of this a pretext for greed? And then thirdly, as he says, he didn't seek glory, personal recognition, or fame. It wasn't about Paul. Paul said it was all about Christ, and that should be our attitude as well. That brings us to verse 7. He says, but we were gentle among you, just as a nursing mother cherishes her own children. The analogy conveys, the author says, both tenderness and concern. Paul provided what the Thessalonians needed in the best possible way. Like a loving mother, he was willing to sacrifice personal comfort so that the Thessalonians could properly develop. So Paul was willing to do without so that they could have. If that's not a picture of a mother, I don't know what is. I know lots of moms who have done without so that their children could have. And so we see that here with the Apostle Paul. Verse 8 says, so affectionately longing for you, we were well pleased to impart to you not only the gospel of God, but also our own lives, because you had become dear to us. The author says the missionaries did not seek to get something from the Thessalonians. They sought to give of themselves as they shared the gospel. Gordon D. Fee concluded, in the end, it is this personal dimension of his relationship with the Thessalonians that separates him so thoroughly from the charlatans who cared nothing for their hearers as people. And so Paul says, you know that I genuinely cared. You know that my concern was for you and not for myself. There's that old saying, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. Many times there's an individual in Ripley that from time to time, especially here across, well, it's not E.W. James anymore, it's Cash Saver now, but he'll stand on the sidewalk there at that intersection of South Washington and Lackey Lane with a bullhorn yelling for people to repent and turn to God. And that's a good message. People do need to repent. The world does need to turn to God. But how many people does that actually reach? People don't know him, know if he actually cares about them or not. You want to make a difference? Identify the people in your life that know that you care about them, that know that you have genuine concern for them. reach out to those people with the gospel. Those are the ones that you're most likely to reach. Those are the ones that you're most likely to help. That brings us to the last section, and that is verses 9 through 12. We now see Paul talking about the behavior of a father. He talked about how he had been gentle among them like a mother, and then we're going to see him talk a little bit about his behavior more as a father. He says, "For you remember, brethren, our labor and toil. For laboring night and day, that we might not be a burden to any of you, we preach to you the gospel of God." The author says this does not mean Paul had no right to accept financial help from those to whom he preached. As Green pointed out, Paul himself taught that the church had the responsibility to sustain its leadership. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is a section about that. But he himself chose not to place any heavy economic obligation on the churches for his own support. Paul gave his detractors no reason to question his sincerity. He had done nothing to take away from the message that he presented to the Thessalonians. And so Paul lets them know, hey, you remember, you saw. If we were in it for the money, then why did we spend all this time working on the side when we could have just demanded that from you? And so Paul lets them know that that wasn't the reason. Verse 10, "You are witnesses, and God also, how devoutly and justly and blamelessly we behaved ourselves among you who believe." And so Paul reminds them, he says, hey, and he gives three different adjectives here. We were devout, we conducted ourselves justly, and we conducted ourselves blamelessly. There was no one the idea of blameless means that there was no one that could levy a charge that could actually stick. Oh yeah, there were those who were probably saying that he had done this, and this, but there was no one who could levy a charge that could back that up with evidence. Paul was blameless in the way that he had behaved among them. Verse 11 is, "You know how we exhorted and comforted and charged every one of you as a father does his own children." There's that analogy that we mentioned as we started this section. He says we conducted ourselves as a father. How a father would do his own children. We exhorted, we comforted, and we charged. We sought to encourage you to do what was right. We comforted you when things were difficult. And we also charged you. We gave you those marching orders. Here's what you need to do. Verse 12, "Charged you that you walk worthy of God, who calls you into his own kingdom and glory." The author of the book says, like a father calling upon and encouraging his children to do what is right, Paul urged the Thessalonians to walk worthy of God. Regarding Paul's self-descriptions, Morris wrote, "Paul has compared himself to the Thessalonians as a mother to her children, a figure that fitted the situation of caring for babies in the faith. But in the ancient world, it was the father who was responsible for the education of the child, so the change in imagery is appropriate. In this case, Paul urged the Thessalonian Christians to live out the gospel." That brings us to our applications, two that the author gives us that we want to notice as we close out this lesson. Number one, he says, the conduct of those who proclaim the gospel matters. This is why Paul declared to the Corinthians, "But I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should become disqualified." You know, it's important that we make sure that we're practicing what we're preaching. Neither his methods of preaching nor his motives for doing so were questionable. His conduct left his enemies little room to find fault. As we seek to reach individuals with the gospel, we must seek to live in a similar manner. In my notes here, I underlined the word "we," because he starts off kind of talking, and it might give the idea in our minds he's talking about simply preachers. And indeed, as preachers, as a preacher, I want to make sure that the way I live my life doesn't detract from the message that I'm seeking to preach. But notice he says that as we seek to reach individuals with the gospel, we must seek to live in a similar manner. All Christians are seeking to preach and teach the gospel to others, or at least we should be. And so we need to make sure that the way that we're living our lives is not detracting from that message. In other words, as the saying goes, we need to be practicing what we're preaching. That brings us to the second application. It is not possible to read Paul's defense of his ministry without noticing his concern for the Thessalonians. Although they were aware of his conduct, he found it necessary to remind them of the care that he had provided for them. Like a nursing mother, he provided the spiritual nourishment the brethren needed. Like a concerned father, he provided moral direction. Paul was not a self-promoter. Paul was a Christ promoter. His concern was for the Thessalonian Christians. He did not allow his opponents to cast doubt on the authenticity or importance of the gospel he preached. Friends, let's make sure that we're promoting Christ too. In all that we say and in all that we do, let's let our light shine. All right, next week we'll go into Lesson 4. Lesson 4 is entitled Conversion, and it's found in the second half of chapter 2, verses 13 through 20. I want to thank you for listening, and I hope that you will make plans to be with us. Once again, right now we're meeting at 10:30 on Sunday morning. Of course, we have this Bible study, and also we go live from our Facebook page on Wednesday nights at 7 o'clock. And starting April 11th, we will also meet at the building at 5 o'clock on Sunday nights for a Bible study. Well, hope you'll join us. Remember, friends, stay healthy, stay hopeful, stay holy, and I hope you have a good day.